video is sponsored by Nebula, and if you stick around until the end, I've got a film recommendation I think you'll really like. They said Lake St. Clair didn't deserve to be called a lake. They called it just a wide spot in the river. And then the lake came for their city. This is the story of Belvidere, Michigan, a city north of Detroit you've probably never heard of, because 3 years after it was founded, it was underwater. It's story time. Depending on your perspective, Lake St. Clair is either a very small or a very large lake tucked between southeast Michigan and Ontario. At about 430 square miles, it's huge compared to your average inland lake. But it's also sandwiched between two of the largest lakes on Earth, Lake Huron and Lake Erie, which makes it seem a little wimpy in context. But having grown up in southeast Michigan, I love Lake St. Clair. And if you love stuff like cars, corn, bread, or working roads, you probably should too, because this lake contains a major shipping route for industry and agriculture. If you're a freighter trying to take your stuff to Detroit, Toledo, or Windsor, whose companies then ship goods all over the place, you have to pass through Lake St. Clair. Now, our story starts in 1835, just before Great Lakes shipping really took off. But there were still boats constantly passing through this area, carrying both people and plenty of supplies. Michigan was on the verge of becoming a state, all kinds of people were moving into this area, and the future was clear. Lake St. Clair was gonna be huge for transportation. So, if you were a businessman and you could find some land along the coast, or even better, if you could find a spot where the lake met a river that would allow people to travel inland, well, now that would be a spot for a business, or even a city. At least, that's what the Conger brothers thought. In 1835, 30-year-old James Conger and his brother David visited this area from Ohio, and they were so struck by its potential that they bought enough land to hold a dream. Here, they declared, where Lake St. Clair meets the Clinton River would be America's next great port city. This would be Belvidere. Now, David eventually backed out of the plan, but James really ran with it. He was already a successful lawyer and businessman, and he's remembered by history as a visionary who could really sell you on an idea. And yes, he did go into politics later in life. James Conger had surveyors draw up designs for Belvidere, and a beautiful city came to life on paper. It would feature cozy homes, thriving businesses, a canal, and spacious parks, so that when the city got crowded, which of course it inevitably would, people would have green space to escape to. And as for the name, well, Belvidere was his wife's middle name. Now, the city wasn't much at the beginning. The Conger brothers had bought the land from 3 other guys, and those guys had mostly spent their time hunting, fishing, farming, and generally doing outdoor stuff. So it wasn't exactly a metropolis. But there was at least a place to host prospective residents. One of the former landowners' houses had been converted into a hotel. So by the next year, 1836, Conger was distributing ads around Ohio, encouraging people to come up to the Belvidere Hotel for a land auction. With just a few bucks and some gusto, you too could own one of the roughly 100 parcels of land in this up-and-coming city. And this ad really tells you something about Conger's talent for sales. He writes that the lots were directly on the great and only route of water communication with the Upper Lakes and the whole Western country. Because remember, this was 1836, and what we now think of as the Western United States was not part of the country yet. But Conger goes on. The location is, beyond all question, one of the most healthy in Michigan, and the surrounding country is well timbered with the finest oak, maple, black walnut, white wood, and other trees to be found in America. In fertility, richness, and depth, The soil is not surpassed by any other in the western states. This country has been settled and well improved for from 30 to 60 years and exhibits some of the finest farms in the world. And within the last 2 or 3 years, a flood of emigrants from New York and the eastern states, possessing both enterprise and wealth, have purchased and settled upon nearly all the lands in this section of country. Conger also talked up the potential of the site. Recently, a railroad company had been hired to build a line from the Clinton River to the city of Saginaw. And another railroad was in the planning and consideration phases that would connect this area to even more Michigan cities. And as for the river itself, it was one of the finest rivers that empty into the western lakes, with beautiful, clear water suitable for boats of any size. Look, when he puts it all like that, I want to move to Belvidere. And I know how this story ends. So, the ads went out. People arrived in Belvidere, and everything seemed like it was going swimmingly. Although actually, maybe that's not the best choice of word. Different sources disagree about how many people came to the auction, but ultimately it seems like somewhere between 15 and 30 families moved to the new city. And around those families, a town began to grow. Belvidere had a general store, a sawmill, a large warehouse, a post office, possibly some carp fisheries, and even an up-and-coming bank. So this was starting to grow into that beautiful city Conger planned on paper. Unfortunately, it was all about to be underwater. Charles Pelkey was a young boy living in Belvidere around this time, and later in his life, he told a story that goes like this. Around 1836, a group of native Ojibwa people were passing through the Belvidere area, and Charles's dad took his son to go meet with them. After chatting for a bit, one of the Ojibwa asked Mr. Pelkey what all this construction noise was, and Charles's dad replied, "We're building a city here, right where the river meets the lake." Great idea, right? Now, the Ojibwa had been living in this land for generations at this point. They knew it and the lake infinitely better than James Conger, despite all of his optimism. So when the Ojibwa told Mr. Pelkey that this was actually a terrible spot to build a town because the lake was eventually gonna flood them all out, you think they might have listened. And yet, because here's the thing. When James Conger visited this area in 1835, the water levels of Lake St. Clair were way down and had been for years. Writers around this time talked about how the lake really was just a wide spot in the river, and how it was so shallow that you could touch the bottom miles offshore. But that was only temporary, and the Ojibwa knew that, regardless of exactly how that story with the Pelkeys really played out. Much like the Great Lakes, the water levels of Lake St. Clair fluctuate over time, and there are different natural cycles behind this. Some years there's more or less precipitation. Some years it's extra hot or extra cold and more or less water evaporates. And long-term, over the decades, the overall climate shifts. Although that is not to be confused with the more extreme human-driven climate change we're facing today. Regardless, when those natural cycles line up in just the right way, you can end up with especially high or low lake levels, with water levels varying anywhere from about 5 to 6 feet long term. And in the 1830s, things were just dry and had been for a while. So you certainly wouldn't worry about little old Lake St. Clair coming to steal your town, until it did. In 1837, the waters started to rise. The Pelkeys moved to nearby Mount Clemens, and by 1838, the town was almost completely unsalvageable. Most of the farmland and all of the town site east of the river were completely underwater. People's basements and even the first floors of their homes were flooded out. Many people either left town, like the Pelkeys, Or, according to an archaeologist I spoke with, they may have tried to drag their houses and all their stuff up to higher ground in the winter when things froze over. The water levels of Lake St. Clair might have been low for decades, but now they were rising up. To the north, Lake Huron was at its highest water levels in 200 years. To the south, Lake Erie drowned trees that had been growing for a century. And here was Belvidere, trapped in the middle. For all his ambitions and dreams, even James Conger couldn't fight nature. And as the story, or perhaps the urban legend goes, as the waters rose, he and his family moved up to the second floor of the Belvidere Hotel. Now, I did say that the water levels went up and down in cycles. So eventually what was left of Belvidere did rise above the waves. But things wouldn't stay dry for long. I mentioned earlier that Lake St. Clair would grow into a major shipping route. Well, in the 1850s, the Army Corps of Engineers widened the north entrance to the lake and carved a deep channel down the middle to make travel easier for ships. But they didn't widen the south exit. So more water flowed into the lake, but it didn't leave any faster. Ultimately, this meant the waters of Lake St. Clair permanently went up another 4 to 5 feet. And so James Conger's dreams for Belvidere continued to die. Also, a side story I enjoyed. So the bank at Belvidere printed a bunch of money, but they didn't get the chance to open before the town flooded. So those bills were basically monopoly money. But one historian from around this time period noted something that made me laugh. He writes that the bills were extensively circulated by the boys of the adjacent country, and in some instances, no doubt, were passed as money upon the ignorant or unwary. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find much information on the other families that lived at Belvidere, but as for James Conger himself, it seemed like he did just fine. Although the timeline is a little unclear, he did eventually move to another Michigan city, and he was prominent and influential enough that he was even elected to the US House of Representatives in 1850. And as for the attempted city, here's what surprised me. When I was first researching this, some sources made it sound like Belvidere is basically Michigan's Atlantis. I mean, it was very clear that there are no perfectly preserved buildings under the waves or anything. It's been 200 years. Wood rots, and the lake is still shallow enough that any structures would have been destroyed by waves or winter ice. But the general impression was of a fully underwater town site. But look at this map here. These are the plans for Belvidere in 1835, and this is that spot today. There's a neighborhood on the old Belvidere site. It's been there for decades, and so far as I can tell, the residents don't all move to the second floor of their houses every couple decades. The difference is they've adapted to the lake. Instead of trying to build farmlands and walkable parks, there are marinas and canals. The water really mingles with the neighborhood. But this is still old Belvidere, and every now and then when the lake is especially high, the water does still encroach on their backyards. So people live in what used to be Belvidere. It's just that from reading and talking to family, it seems like nobody knows its story. It's memorialized in Belvidere Street and Conger Drive, but James Conger's great dream, America's next great port city, it's now just a neighborhood. A lovely neighborhood, but a neighborhood nonetheless. In this series, I explore Earth's ancient, fascinating places, as long as they're in Michigan. But if you want to explore some of the oldest and newest places around the entire planet, I've got a recommendation. It's a documentary called Oldest and Newest Places on Earth, and it follows host Joe Scott as he travels around the globe, guided by scientists, to visit Earth's oldest and newest places. Like, he goes to the Arctic Circle to stand on 4 billion-year-old rock. This is a film I wish I had made, so I think you'll really like it. If you want to give it a watch, it is exclusively available on Nebula, which is a streaming service where you can also find these videos early and 100% ad-free. Nebula is a service with highly vetted creators, no ads, no AI-driven shows, and thoughtful videos you can't find anywhere else. And it's also really cheap. If you use the link go.nebula.tv/Alexis Dahl, you can get 50% off a yearly subscription. That's $30 for the entire year, which comes down to $250 per month. And if you watch Oldest and Newest Places on Earth, let me know what you think. As always, thanks for being here. I hope you learned something that makes you think about the world just a little differently, and I'll see you soon.